Spatial History Lab website, and it's a project that we've been working on for about 5 years now, and we're just publishing next week the book out of the project. So it's a collection of about 100 maps and an accompanying text, which is really exploring the potential for utilising geographical information science and geovisualisation and digital humanities within Holocaust studies. And so we took 6 case studies, one at the European continental scale, which is the SS camp system, the geography of the SS camp system, one at the national scale, which is the deportation of Italian Jews, one at the regional scale, which is the Einsatzgruppen killings in the east, one at the camp scale, which is a reconstruction of the building of Auschwitz, one at the city scale, which is Jewish life in Budapest, and then one at the body scale, which is evacuations, death marches, and the kind of embodied experience, gendered embodied experience. So we try to think, as geographers approach anything through the lens of scale. It felt like scale was a way to try and think about the Holocaust happening at multiple scales, from the body through to the continent. And so we try and capture that in the project. And most of the book is it's snapshots. It's a series of visuals that are trying to uncover spatial patterns. But we've also done a few accompanying animated maps. Maybe I could just show you a couple. There's some on this website which you may find of interest. So this one, if I press run, it's just one that goes through the period from 1933 and should at some point show the opening and closing of the SS camp system. Oh, hang on, sorry, let's stop it, take it back. It's a GIS layered map, and I forgot to click the layers. So let's show the main camps, and let's also show the sub-camps, and let's play it again. So what we should get now is, let's put the names in as well. We aren't getting any camps at all, are we? Have we got any camps coming?
The other, no. Show territory name first.
Territory names will do that. Take that off. I wonder, it might be, it's made in Flash. We've got changing territories appearing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's working, so the
yeah, it's showing that, which is weird, isn't it? Perhaps another browser. Watch it at home. So anyway, what you would see is, if you watch it at home on a browser that supports Flash, this is weird because it does kind of work in a sense, doesn't it? So what we have been trying to experiment with a little bit is to think about animated maps as a way of showing change over time and space. What you see, actually, that's really interesting, I think, is you see the proliferation of subcamps in 1944, and you really see the shift eastwards and then back westwards. And so it may be a useful graphic just to give students a sense of the kind of speed and scale of the expansion and retraction of the SS camp system. It's great at the end, you kind of see this way in which the right becomes this little tiny space. You know, it's gradually the Allies are moving from east and west, and then you reduce to just that handful of camps that are left in 45, like Dachau and places that have been liberated in 1945. So what we've done in the book is we have a series of statics of these kinds of images, but we've also gone for some animated maps that are on the Stanford site. Let's see if this works. What we did here, this is a bit kind of crazier, I think, is in Budapest. It's a very dispersed ghetto. In Budapest there's yellow star houses up until November, so June to November. So these are all the yellow star houses that we mapped out onto a GIS layer in Budapest. The yellow star houses, there's a curfew period when Jews can leave the houses to go and do shopping and things. So we just thought, actually, where might people have gone during this period? Let's put the yellow star houses in. There you go. Those aren't the yellow star houses, that's the lens, isn't it? Yeah. These are the yellow star houses here. I thought, why are they all over there? And then if we play this, this is running from 2 o'clock, which is when the curfew starts. then what we did was we just were thinking, actually, where in the city might Jews have been leaving? And we've done, the numbers are related to the different size of the yellow star houses. The Jews are going to the market halls within the vicinity. And it's one of the things that we're quite interested in is more speculative things, which is really, in a sense, almost creating new kinds of sources. So piecing together material that we have to try and visualize. In particular here, we're interested in bystanders. So we're interested in how visible would Jews have been in Budapest during this period. And so we have we talk it through. So we talk through as a kind of sound that you can hear as we talk about what we're seeing on this map. And I think some of our work, this is some of our more speculative work, where what we are sure about is we're confident about the street network, we're confident about the Yellow Star House location, we're confident about the market hall location, but of course we don't know what streets Jews walked on, and we don't know whether Jews chose main streets or side streets. What we're doing here is we're working with just the shortest route, because we know that the lines build up very quickly in the stores. But we're trying to, in a sense, use geovisualization as a way to kind of really push things in order to ask new questions. And so a lot of the mapping that we've been doing is like the question of process with the memory walk idea. A lot of our mapping is about process rather than product. So I think whenever people see a map, they assume that's a kind of final product, whereas actually for us, maps are much more about a process, a research process. And so what we're interested in doing is we're interested in taking information. We then map it as a way to try and generate new questions and go back to the archive with those questions. And so, for example, one of the things that we're interested in here is in mapping out Budapest and the dispersed ghetto. We're interested in thinking about distance. And so suddenly it generates a lot of new questions about distance and proximity and how that affects Jewish experiences. And then we go back to the archive and we listen to the survivor testimony with an ear to distance and proximity, and to the kinds of places that people go. And so for us, I think the book is very much intended to be 100 visualizations and maps that reveal 100 processes rather than products. And I guess that's one of our, the things we talk about that a bit in this piece, that I think is difficult, isn't it, about anything that we do, is that to me the process is always more important than the product, but actually often a map is immediately picked up on as a product. And I guess one of the things that I want critical thinking, to me, is to ask a lot of really difficult questions about any of the maps that we produced. And so in the text, we invite that, because we lay bare the whole process. Any map is only as good as the database that the map is based on. And you have to ask really difficult questions about the database. And so I think we're really trying to invite that with the text. I guess what I wouldn't want is that people just shortchange and take the maps out of the text and then use them as a kind of finished product, because they're much more intended as a sort of process. Maybe the memory walk films might be the same in some ways, isn't it? I think that's always kind of one of these questions, isn't it? Is when you, something that's primarily a process focused a project, what happens when the process becomes a product and is then reread in different ways, and so it's kind of seen in different sort of terms. And I think that's one thing we'd be really conscious of. So we're really engaged at the moment, I think, in a lot of questions about the pedagogical value of our maps. I think they do have a pedagogical value because they maybe allow people to see things in a new way, but we very much also see them, and primarily see them, as having a kind of process value. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff on the Stanford History website, so maybe have a look at some point if you want.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Did you also consider having enabling users to manipulate more?
Yeah.
For example, to have assumptions about the percentage of Jews that actually do go to the synagogue.
Yeah, so you can modify everything. So we're very much seeing this as a departure, as a model which you can just you can modify in any way you want. So in a sense, this becomes a way that you generate a discussion among students about what this is like. So that we wanted to have that sense that this is a model to play with. This is not reality. This is actually about generating research questions or asking what it's like to be Jewish in a city. And I think, in a sense, what would be great is to use that alongside the oral testimony and the memoir accounts to engage in a kind of discussion about, well, if you're Jewish, I mean, do you go onto the streets? When do you go to the streets? Do you want to go alone, together? Like, how dangerous are the streets? What's your experience? So we try and introduce that very much into the conversation. Yeah.
Can you show a little animation or examples?
Sorry, can we?
can you show us some examples about the modification, mobility?
Yeah, so for example here, say walking speed, let's have a prompt. So if this is when Jews leave promptly at 2 o'clock. Let's say they're going to leave at 2:08. Let's say they're going to like rush out, and let's say they're going to spend just a few minutes shopping. Apply these settings, and then what we'll see is that we have a much slower period. So if we go back to here, it'll then run it. So what it will do is then it'll run it with those different parameters. So you can play with the parameters entirely and modify the model in whatever way you want. Let's go back to 2 o'clock and play again. Okay, and so now it's going to be at 2:08 when people start leaving rather than at 2 o'clock. And it's going to be a much faster experience, and then we're going to come back much quicker as well. So there's a sense in which you can set the parameters to whatever you want, so you can alter this model entirely. And we have some preset parameters. So if you just play it as a static visual, there's some preset parameters which we work with, but you can alter the parameters in any way you want, which is really about the sense, this is not reality. This is actually a model that you experiment with, because it's about generating some questions and about exploring this urban space. Yeah, so you just go into that bit up there, and then you modify the model. So for us, that was really important, that it's a model that you can modify, because it's a model. I mean, I don't know if it's any value at all, to be honest. Yeah.
I wanted to ask actually, but you just explained that it's more probable, because I wanted to ask how, if it's based on or compared somehow with the statements of people of passers-by and so on from that time, if it's based also on this type of knowledge of the memories and so on, like for example shopping would take that and that much time, and why, what was the...
We worked quite a bit with oral history accounts, so on people talking about the lines building up quickly, and then we say, okay, so maybe you make an assumption that people leave straight away, and people try and get there as fast as they can through a direct route. So we based it around the oral history accounts. But I think what we're interested in with any of these is really actually, if you just visualize something, what kinds of new questions does it spark in your mind? And so I think that's a lot of the digital humanities work. And a lot of the kind of visualization is really about seeing things in a new way. And so that's very much what this strand of our work is about, is almost kind of using the imagination, harnessing the imagination, to really then go back to the archives with new questions. So we use this is where it's processed. So a lot of our maps don't see the light of day. Actually, we do publish them all in the book, or most of them, because we want them to be there, because we want people to see our process. Because the book is about the process, but we really see mapping as a way of brainstorming and visualizing as a way of brainstorming. So we see it as a part of a kind of creative process. So in a sense, I think one of the things about digital humanities is it's really reformulating the way we work potentially as historians. Actually, I think in quite radical ways.
I also saw that you also can choose the options for the executions for the synagogues, but
yes,
I assume in that segment you should be more realistic, and I don't know how that works in like places of executions, and have you used some of the chronology to know on such a day so many people were executed, or how that segment of your map was working? If you place this one police curfew in a like kind of imaginative way, but this should be more based on fact.
Yeah, this is based on fact. So all of the points, the fixed points, are all based on fact.
Yeah, I understand, but you know, do you have some kind of chronology on that? You know, that in such a day, so many people were executed at this very place, etc.
No, I mean somewhere like this is kind of constant points of execution in a sense between November. This is from a different period. So what we were trying to think about is here's just another layer that you can add on, which gives you maybe a little bit more context. What you could do is you could ultimately create something which has multiple layers. So you could have 20, 30. I mean, that's the thing about GIS is just a way that you build up layer upon layer. And what you can do is you can see if there's any significance. So I mean, is there any significance to where the places of execution are? Does it relate in any way to where people are moving or not? So these are just kind of layers that you could add on in any way. And I think that's where GIS mapping is about experimentation. So it's about putting layers together that you maybe haven't thought of putting together and seeing if there's any connection. Like, do you start to see spatial patterns emerge out of that? So that's really kind of what we were thinking about.
Can I also ask something? I was just wondering, you said something about, so did you visualize the visibility of the Jewish community there, and also in relation to bystanders, how visible were they? But if I heard you correctly, you do not know exactly which streets they use. But for me, isn't that really important, knowing which streets they used to have an idea of how visible they actually were? That was something that we didn't really
Yeah, I mean, what we did with this was we just constructed, so if you know the fixed points people are moving from to, you can work with a set of assumptions. Is the assumption that actually people take the low-cost route, which is to get there as quickly as possible? Do people take main streets or side streets? In a sense, what we wanted to do was create a map that forced you to ask those questions and to try and think about how you might then go to the archive to think about, well, are certain streets mentioned a lot in survivor testimony? And are there, in a sense, people imagining places of safety and danger within the city? So we try to get, in a sense, using maps as a way to flush out a new kind of engagement and discussion, which is really, I think, to think about the Holocaust as very much something that takes place in urban landscapes and rural landscapes, and actually things like this street, that street, may make a huge amount of difference. So the kind of map is a way of drawing an attention to an experience that doesn't just kind of happen in a vacuum, but in a very real kind of urban environment.
But isn't it also so that, I mean, streets were extremely important, that people could be saved or killed or captured just because they were in a particular place at a particular time?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's, Dinka's now doing this work, isn't she, on rescue, like mapping rescue in Amsterdam, is that right?
It's places of hiding.
Yeah, places of hiding. And I mean, I think, to me, those kind of things are really, I mean, that's, in a sense, part of our vision. So the group at the moment, what we've done is we've just done more experimental work, which is really about generating processes, experimenting with different ways of mapping and visualizing. What I think we'd really like to do in the next stage of the project is to think about, well, how could you start to construct some of these maps so that they can, in a sense, talk to each other? So that you could, for example, I mean, really we're about trying to uncover spatial patterns. So is there a sense, if you were to map every hiding place in Europe, I mean, where were they? Like, in which streets were they, which areas were they, at what period of time, what kind of patterns? And so it's trying to think about those things, which is almost to approach it from a different way, which is not necessarily to read the paperwork of what to look at on the ground, what's happening, kind of the bottom-up kind of exploration, and then to understand and uncover what those patterns mean, you know, in places. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if it's, for example, you have there this question, how long they did the shopping and things like that. I mean, do you also have on the mark, for example, spots where the shops were, or for example, and also with the timeline, like, I mean, it was more difficult to get to the shop in the 1942 than in the, or in the 1944 than in the 1942. So, because I don't understand how to find how you would know how long would take the shopping in this time and this time, and how does the data relate to how fast they walk and this and that, and so that's...
Isn't that also more pointing out that, making explicit that it's a choice, and saying, well, there is a margin of error, because we cannot find out how quick people were walking on average.
Yeah.
And it's also, I get, perhaps it's not the most important point, but you do have, for example, how many people actually attended the synagogue, and how much interaction was there between Jews and non-Jews. I mean, that would be, because now it's sort of the only thing you're going to do is go to the synagogue or go to the market. Well, look at your own life. There, you also visit friends and you can go out. But that would be a huge difference, and how many people are actually from non-Jewish would go into the ghetto. So I like the approach that you ask a lot of new questions because of this, but you will never have this as a realistic picture.
I don't mean realistic, but probable, you know, because of course we're not going to know how many shops were there, but it's difficult, it's different, even the way you will move is different, because you have, I don't know, 2 shops on the street, but you have to walk 10 kilometers to get to one or something, you know. So just,
And I mean, I think that's interesting, that probable. I think the maps that we create, some of them we would say we're pretty confident that this is a map that doesn't represent reality but gets close to, and some of them we say, whoa, this is like highly speculative. And so in a sense, what we were interested in this book is about really pushing the idea of what a map could be, and pushing the idea of how you might engage with the historical past from one, which is where I think we see ourselves making a kind of bigger conceptual methodological contribution to history. I think really kind of challenging the nature of what history is as a discipline and historical geography is a discipline. So it's a very kind of provocative book, I think, because it's intended to really ask some big questions. And I think, to me, this is critical thinking, I think, is to ask questions about what's known and what's not known, and like, how do we deal with that? And that, in a sense, we know nothing about the past, do we? In some ways, like the past, all we know is from the sources that we have, which it gets us back in some ways to the past. And so we're very interested in that, is really, what sources do we have? So we know the addresses of the Yellow Star houses in Budapest. But then after that, it gets a bit more tricky. So we have some rich source material about this person that lived in this house, but not that house. Was it the same or different? Like, how much was social class a part of this? That actually what we tend to have is the stories of wealthier Jews rather than poorer Jews. You know, that to me is where you start to get into really interesting questions about kind of getting people to think. And so that's, in a sense, what we try and do is not give someone, this is where I think process is more important than product. I think product doesn't make you think. I think process makes you think. Because product is like, this is what the reality of Budapest in 44 was. I mean, process is like, actually, you know, if you're a Jew in 44, you need to go to the shops. Like, well, what kind of decisions? Like, and you're a non-Jew in 44 in Budapest. I mean, do you see Jews? Do you not see Jews? When you see Jews, what do you think? What about if the Jew is your neighbour? How do you interact? So that's the kind of thing we're trying to get people to engage with, is to ask those questions. And that, for us, those feel like really important research questions, which then pushes back into the archive to see. Yeah.
I was just wondering, were you also thinking of putting another layer on it, like an extra Google map on the historical map, so to see where those points were and are now today?
Yeah, that's really easy to do. So we do that with Auschwitz. Okay. So you can layer with Auschwitz, like the aerial photographs, you know, taken by the Allies in 44. You can layer it with the kind of contemporary. So yeah, I mean, that's the joy of GIS in many ways, is that once you create a GIS, it's very, very easy to add extra layers. So you can just keep building. And I think one of the things we would love to do in a future project is, if we can make it robust enough, is that, in a sense, we invite you to add additional layers, so that in some ways we build something which you can then add to. So we're talking with the Shoah Foundation. We hope to work with the Shoah Foundation to really work with their archive and to do something together, which would kind of allow, you know, like schools, researchers, to kind of add, you know, like Hypercities, the Hypercities project out of UCLA, which is a project which is really about inviting, you know, people to contribute to research. Well, but we need a lot of money. It's a big project.
You were speaking about going to the archives to try to answer all kinds of additional questions. Have you been able to contact survivors to see what kind of reactions are triggered among those people when you tell them about your assumptions when making these maps?
Yeah, we haven't done that. That would be really interesting to do. I use maps quite a lot as a prompt with survivors when I interview them. So I'll often have a map, like a Budapest, on the table with a survivor, and ask them, in a sense, as a prompt so that they're talking about it. But we haven't done that. That would be a nice project to do, I think. Yeah.
When you talk about like engaging young people, I think it's a very good way of making it more visible, because it's sometimes hard to use your imagination, because it's 70 years ago, it's all in black and white or something. So I was thinking, did you consider also having like a street view image as a layer on
yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, we did, there was, I think one of the things that we, I think are being torn about at the moment is that our project has primarily been a research project, which is primarily about posing a new methodology for the research community. And we've got all of this kind of interesting, more pedagogical dimensions alongside. So, for example, we took photographs of every yellow star house in Budapest, and it would be very easy to have that as an extra there. So you just go on the yellow star house, you click, and you can see the house today, and it still stands. We haven't built that in a sense because of lack of money really to do that, and we've prioritised the more conceptual and theoretical roles. What I think we are interested in doing now is the book comes out and then we're going to create an e-book out of it, which we see as having a much greater pedagogical value. So for example, what we'll do in the e-book is that we'll have a film of the tram going from here to here, so that you can see this major street that was meant to be cleared of Jewish houses on the 9th of May, 1944, and then is full of Jewish houses on the 16th of May, 16th of June, 1944. And so what we'll do in the book is that in that section of the text you click and then you see a film from the tram as we go along that major street. And we talk about that process, and we'll integrate as well then at that point spider interviews from the Shell Foundation. And so what we're going to do in the ebook is create a much more multi-dimensional text, which allows you to develop those kinds of aspects and angles. So that's very much the vision for the next project. So we're applying for funding at the moment to do this.
Was it similar to in other the tram?
Yeah, there's a tram in all the doors about it.
But there's like a movie.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was just a tangential introduction. No, but I think it's interesting. I think we should talk more about process and product.
Yeah.
Like, to me, actually, that's a really important question.
Yeah.
And in a sense, as historians, I mean, we produce products as historians, don't we? Like books, articles. But I think I'm quite interested in laying bare the process within everything I write. And that feels to me, this is like the question about curatorial voice, isn't it? So, you know, in a museum context, I suppose one of the shifts within the sort of postmodern museum has been much more to a sense of introducing the curatorial voice in a much more explicit way. The Imperial War Museum, the new Second World War galleries, I think we were talking about this, Karen, have, in a sense, 3 voices, quite explicit, and so gone in the Imperial War Museum as a kind of dominant curatorial voice, introduced now as a sense of much more contest of different voices, the voice of the designer, the voice of a historian, the voice of a curator, a named curator. And I think in my own work I'm really interested in doing that. So the book I did on Hungary, the deportations in Hungary, is in many ways a book actually which is about historical method and process. And I think I guess the danger is that you become so kind of postmodern process obsessed that you kind of say nothing and you reduce everything to a kind of process is all. I think actually to me that the process is massively important in also developing the product, and it's about thinking creatively about how those two fit together. And so maybe we can talk more about that. But what I wanted to also talk about is to say something about 2 things, which again maybe we can talk about a little bit. One I think is about authenticity. Because I just want to talk about some of the visitors to Holocaust sites, and obviously that's like us this morning going to the Anne Frank Annex. That, what is it about going to an authentic site, in particular within an educational context? And I think authenticity, I think, raises much bigger questions about ultimately what it is that what do we see as the value of introducing anyone to the Holocaust, or taking someone to an authentic site like Anne Frank House or Auschwitz. So what's the point of the Holocaust within education and memory, full stop, is the big question, I think. And I think one of the questions that authenticity raises is in particular the notion of the witness. So how far is there a kind of memory function, and how far is witnessing one of the key ideas? And I want to talk about that in particular with regard to the Holocaust Educational Trust work of taking school children from Britain to Auschwitz, where very much I think there's a sense, I think a problematic sense, in which these children then become witnesses. And so that maybe is kind of an important thing for us to think about. I think there's a lot of issues there about kind of education and memory, the relationship between education, history and memory. And then the second thing I think is also about the kind of transformative potential of going to Holocaust sites, which I think is, to me, is like the nub issue, is what do we hope to achieve from this, and how far can the Holocaust transform anyone? So how far does, which relates to the question of Jan Frank House and that new film, I think, isn't it? Which is like the old You Choose. The choice is the old exhibition.
Oh yeah, if you choose or the new...
It's I think the connection between history, so the first thing is the connection between history and memory, secondly the connection between history and ethical behaviour, transformation, identity transformation, a kind of moral transformation. And to me I think memory and morality are like the kind of nub issues. History, memory, morality, to me feel like real nub issues within Holocaust education and Holocaust memory. And so maybe I just thought we could look at a few visitors to think about, that. I don't want to talk primarily about Holocaust tourism, although we can reflect on that. I mean, I think one thing that is really interesting about Holocaust tourism is the way that Holocaust tourism, I think, is framed within the guidebook narratives as having a kind of moral and transformative nature to it. So I did some analysis of the guidebooks to Poland from the last 50 years for Western visitors. And what was really striking is the way in which they position Auschwitz-Birkenau as a very different site from other sites that you visit within Poland, and that they talk in particular in kind of morally laden terms about the way in which a visit there will be in some ways transformative to you as a human being. And that to me is one of the kind of nub issues, I think, in Holocaust education, is do we expect a student to study the Holocaust to be transformed in a way that we don't expect when we teach the French Revolution? So is there a sense in which the Holocaust becomes a kind of unique moment in history that has a kind of unique transformative potential? And are Holocaust sites perceived to have a kind of Holocaust transformative potential that just going to another place doesn't have? So that's, to me, is a really key question.
The word that you use, nub issues, is that vocal or something, nub issues?
Nub issue, like a kind of key issue, like a sort of major issue. So what I want to do, just quickly, 5 groups of people. American Jewish photographer Susan Silas, it goes to the route of one of the death marches, the Helmbrecht March, a group of German charismatic Christians who also go to the route of one of the death marches. March of the Living, probably well known to all of us, what can touch on much more briefly, kind of Jewish teenage pilgrimage. Holocaust Educational Trust, I think, are interesting in terms of their kind of assumptions that they have about authentic sites and Holocaust education. And then I wanted to finish just with one thing I've been interested in more recently is what about survivors who return. I just wrote a piece in Memory and History about that, about survivors who return to Auschwitz. But I start with Susan Silas, who I think is an interesting photographer. When she publishes the piece, it's not a march, it's a walk, that she suddenly realizes that, in a sense, the kind of authenticity that she craved was impossible, both for the fact that time and space don't shrink, but also the fact that she couldn't vicariously enter into the experience of marching, because she was a lone walker. And actually one of the most interesting things about her reflections, I think, is that the vulnerability she feels is as an isolated lone woman walking the road, where she's mistaken for a prostitute by drivers, and she's very much experiencing a different kind of sense of danger as a single lone woman walking than as someone who's been marched within a group of 680 women. And she's crucially seeing the landscape differently. Because she's walking, she looks around her and she pauses to take photographs. And suddenly I think what's interesting is right at the end of the photographic piece, in a sense she really rubbishes the entire 48 photographs, which is to say, I saw this, but the survivors saw nothing. That actually, for the survivors, they didn't see anything. And so she's really, I think, forcing this kind of experiential distance between then and now. So rather than shrinking the distance between then and now, I think the project kind of pushes it apart and expands it. It's interesting what Tim Ingold writes about marching, that he talks about marching as transport, and he talks about walking as much more a different mode of experiencing landscape. And I think what's fascinating is that even though she's walking the same roads in Europe, actually she's experiencing that landscape in a radically different way, and the artwork becomes a way in which she starts to explore and encounter that. Now, to me, I start with that because I think that poses really important questions about the educational value of taking young people to authentic sites. Because I think often the assumption is that that shrinks spatial fix to time and history, and I think it also sometimes is framed upon an assumption of a kind of notion of almost a vicarious witnessing. So that's kind of what I want to unpack, in the second half. Yeah.
I'm asking myself why you're using the word authentic place. Me, as working as a so-called authentic place, I would never say authentic place. It's a historical place with multi-layers. You can't say that's the history of Dachau, but there's all those different layers, and we try to teach this. And we would never have the idea to bring children to an authentic place. I don't know how the others see it that work in those places, but this is not a word we're using, or this is not a concept we're using.
I mean, I think what's interesting is that I think people have very varying notions of how far authenticity is important or not. I think for some of the people that we'll look at, authenticity is absolutely key, primarily because authenticity is tied to moral transformation. So I think this is one of the critical issues, that if the ultimate aim of Holocaust education is some kind of identity or behavioural change, and I think often that's grounded in the kind of notion of authenticity and a sense of that. And I think we'll see that with some of these projects. So I think what you do in Dachau is unusual, and I think it contrasts, say, markedly with what Holocaust Educational Trusts do in the British context, actually. Like, I think that would be very interesting, is to ask a series of educators, why do you take people to the camps? I think they would give very different answers to that question, actually. And to me, those are some of the really fundamental questions within those of us engaged in Holocaust education, is almost our underlying assumptions, and kind of critical issues, I think, about why we think there's an importance to the Holocaust, why do we spend our lives teaching it? Those are the really fundamental kind of key issues. These guys are really interesting, I think. So it's based out of, it's a group of German charismatic Christians, based from Tübingen. It's called TOS International Ministries, led by Jobst Bittner. And in 2007, for the first time, they do almost like a prayer and remembrance, kind of reconciliation, forgiveness walk on the route of one of the death marches towards Dachau, the evacuations to Dachau in April 1945. So they choose the same routes, they choose the same time. So like Silas, they want this kind of authenticity of experience, that it's about the anniversary of the evacuations, and it's about the very same routes. Although they're interesting, I think, because the next year in 2008, they shift from this kind of concern to authenticity to a concern more with a kind of symbolic enactment. So in 2007, it's much more a concern that we need to march the route that they marched in 1945, on the same days they marched. In 2008, what they do is they recreate a symbolic Star of David across the German landscape by connecting a series of sites to recreate a symbolic Star of David across the German landscape, and that's what they march. So it's a very different kind of way of engaging with the landscape, which is much more concerned with symbolism rather than authenticity, and so they're a very interesting organisation. They move into Eastern Europe, and they go to... These are the charismatic Christians. Yeah, so they go in to Ukraine, to Latvia, Lithuania, so they start to kind of push out this kind of rewalking. Now, what I think is really interesting about them is that they see a kind of a real transformation that's possible by walking these death marches routes. That they really see it as, in a sense, kind of breaking up the ground in some kind of spiritual sense, so that through walking and prayer walking, that they are engaged in an act of calling for forgiveness for the German people, and ultimately for what they talk about, breaking the veil of silence, and they very much position this within a kind of broader German context, I think, of the intergenerational, multi-generational sense of veil of silence. And so they're really about, an act of walking is about a laying bare of a kind of hidden and erased history. One of the things that interests them, I think, in the Death March routes is that these are very ordinary spaces. So they're not the well-known landscapes like the camps, like Dachau or the Wannsee Villa, which they do go to, but they're the very unknown places. And for them, it's really about a kind of uncovering of what they see as a sort of hidden history which is partly hidden by their parents and grandparents, but is also hidden by the GDR. So they're very concerned about kind of uncovering this sort of layers, these layers of hiding within the context of the GDR. What strikes me about them, I think, is that they see within this act, these kind of really radical notions of transformation, that they go back to these landscapes to engage in a kind of transformation of the entire kind of spiritual and political world. They tie it very much in with a sort of Christian Zionism, which sees in the return of Jews to Israel the hope of the coming again of the Messiah kind of notion. So there's a sense in which they have big aims for this war. Now, what I'm interested in is that sense of how big our vision is as educators for kind of what we hope to achieve. That they hope to achieve through this, kind of like entire eschatological transformation. But maybe we have more modest aims than that. And I think March of the Living are interesting because they're also engaged in marching. They're engaged in marching, which is both, I think, about the route of the evacuations, but is also about these fixed sites of the death camps, which are maybe the more ordinary or the more normal kind of sites, authentic sites that we take students to, which is to take students to the camp. You probably know quite a lot about March of the Living. First started in 1988. It originally takes place just every 2 years, and then from 1996 onwards it takes place on an annual basis. And it's really focused around a visit around Poland, followed by a visit to Israel, with the key moment being this symbolic march between Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, between main camp at Auschwitz and then Birkenau, which is with students literally draped in the flag, so wearing the Israeli colours, and marching 5 abreast. And it's very much about a kind of re-performance in some ways of the movement of Jews within the camp system that are kind of revisualized, but are kind of following their footsteps, but actually a kind of rewriting, a reframing of that, which I think is really striking. And this is one of the things that is in the brochure that's issued to all of the marchers, that is interesting, I think, in terms of talking about both authenticity of the route that's taken. You'll retrace the steps of the March of Death, the actual route, the real, the kind of sense of the authentic. And yet this time, however, there'll be a difference. It'll be a March of the Living, with thousands of Jewish sheep like yourself marching shoulder to shoulder, culminating in the memorial service at one of the gas chambers in Birkenau. And what I think is striking about March of the Living is the way in which there's a sense in which the actual quickly becomes the transformation. But the actualness of the route is really, really important to that transformation. There's a sense in which it's both reenacting the footsteps of the 6 million, as they talk about in their literature, but it's also reversing, in a sense, the footsteps of the 6 million within a kind of Zionist narrative of destruction and rebirth, which is very common in, say, Yad Vashem, Israeli tellings of the Holocaust. And obviously the thing about March of the Living is that their aspiration is for Jewish teenagers to identify much more strongly with Jewishness and with Israel, with Zionism. That's the kind of fundamental aim of the project, that is critically achieved at this very moment where this march is enacted on an actual route that's kind of reinterpreted, not as a march of death, but a march of the living, and then obviously extended as the second march takes place on the streets of Jerusalem on the Day of Independence, celebrating the independence of the Israeli state. You've got these kind of two pivotal moments in the Israeli memorial calendar, Holocaust Memorial Day followed by the celebration of independence and a mourning of veterans, of those lost in the wars in Israel, particularly in '48. And those become the kind of framework for these two marches that take place, which the geography of where they take place is obviously really critical within these spaces. And I think what I'm interested in is this idea of what's the relationship between the actual and the transformational, and how far are those kind of pivotal within education. And that really interests me about this organisation, Holocaust Educational Trust, who I know well. I'm on their educational advisory team, and I have been along to their, I'm a kind of critical friend of theirs, I guess, in some ways. Maybe more critical of a friend. No, I think I'm a genuinely critical friend. of this organisation. It's, I mean, what strikes me is that it's funded by the British state, so it's the British government that funds school children to visit Auschwitz. And if you look at the growing numbers of visitors in Auschwitz, what you'll see is a kind of growing number of British visitors to Auschwitz, which is really fueled by the economics of the British state deciding that school children should visit Auschwitz. The aspiration of the British state is that 2 school children from every school in the UK, aged between 16 and 17, should visit Auschwitz and then return to tell a story about that, which is fascinating in and of itself about why a state would give so much of its budget, education budget, to that process.
Would that be each year?
Each year, yeah, so as an ongoing basis, so each year this would happen.
How long does it take? Are you coming to Poland for 2 days, for 3 days, or are you playing for 1 day and going back?
Playing for 1 day.
This is very...
Yeah, so what happens is the students had a 3-day program, which is 3 separate days. So it's an afternoon in groups of regional groups of about 200, where they have a little bit of a historical introduction to the Holocaust. They listen to the words of an Auschwitz survivor, so an Auschwitz survivor comes and speaks to the group. And they do some really interesting work about Holocaust tourism. So they reflect on the strangeness of what they're about to do. They talk about whether they're going to take a camera or not, and about tourist practices. So they do some really interesting work, I think, which is almost about deconstructing what they're about to do and kind of questioning what they're about to do. So it's a little bit of history, it's survivor testimony, and then it's a kind of self-reflective deconstruction of what they're going to engage in. Which is a week later, they then go to Auschwitz, so leave at 6 in the morning from the UK, fly to Krakow, take the bus to Auschwitz. And what they do there is they go to the Jewish cemetery or the synagogue, former synagogue in Auschwitz. So a little bit about pre-war Jewish life in Poland. Then they go through the museum at Auschwitz I with a guide, you know, the kind of normal guided experience of going through Auschwitz I. Then have some lunch, and then go to Birkenau, and the guide is with them for the beginning. And then there's a walk up to the gas chambers and crematory at Birkenau, and then there's a service of remembrance. As the dusk starts to fall, so as night starts to fall, there's a service, there's a rabbi who is there, who says Hadish, prays for the dead, he blows the shofar, there's some readings from the students, which are kind of a series of selected readings. There's a little talk by the rabbi, there's a talk by the educator, and then the students walk back to the bus with a candle, which they then light on the tracks as they go back. So it's a kind of really interesting experience, I think, of a mix of places. So pre-war Jewish life, Auschwitz I, Birkenau, and very different things that are happening in each of those places. And then a week later, back in the UK, they come back together, and then they look at the sense of lessons from Auschwitz. So what's the kind of contemporary lessons that they can draw from their experience, and then they go off to do a series of activities within their school framed around those lessons. So it's a kind of 3-stage process of preparing through a bit of history, testimony, the experience of the place, and then a kind of follow-up activity, which is really about the lessons of Auschwitz.
Is it a matter of budget that they go 1 day, or?
Yeah, a large part of this budget, I think, is the cost of overnight accommodation, and I think, you know, working with 16, 17-year-olds, it's kind of the issues of that. So it's a sort of sense of...
in the evaluation, it would never come up that it might be good to have a little more time?
Exactly.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting there. I think,
critical of this.
yeah, I think it's probably good. I mean, I think it originally goes out of the rabbi who goes with them, who started this for his congregation in the 1980s. So he was the first to start taking day trips to Auschwitz in the UK. And so there's a kind of longer tradition within the UK of this being a kind of model of visitation of Auschwitz, which is almost partly about the intensity of the experience, a very early start, a very late arrival back, a kind of intense, kind of sudden exposure. So it's a very particular kind of visitation, which I think is different, isn't it, from March of the Living? I think, you know, there's a sense in which going to any place, even the same authentic site, is experienced differently depending on whether you've been in Poland for a week or you fly in from Luton that morning, and it's about who you're with and that kind of framing of how that takes place. I mean, I think what's really important here is the way in which the survivor testimony frames so much of their experience of the place. And so as they walk towards the gas chambers, what I've been struck by when I've been there with the groups is that they talk about walking in the footsteps of the survivor. So the survivor's story is the story which really kind of mediates the space, and they talk about the survivor and about his family or her family as they walk. So that very much is the kind of entry point as a way of kind of positioning their experience of this place.
I think it's a very interesting project. I'm just wondering why this service with the rabbi? I'm just generally wondering why is that? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about the project is that it starts as a very kind of historical experience. It ends as a kind of quasi-religious experience.
But then why a rabbi? Is it because of the?
I mean, I think it's the kind of positioning of the importance of the Jewish story at Auschwitz very much. I mean, it's you know, obviously there's many victim groups at Auschwitz. Jews are the predominant victim group at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and so in a sense the survivor is always a Jewish survivor, and so it's very much kind of following the Jewish victim story.
And that's explained to them. I mean,
it's not explained to them. There's a little bit in the historical context about the sense that the Holocaust happens in other places other than Auschwitz, that there's other victims other than Jews. But after that, I think there's a sense in which it is primarily a Jewish Auschwitz survivor who becomes the predominant vehicle for this experience. I think that isn't explained to students.
And just out of the curiosity, do they visit also the Block 13 in there or not?
No. No. Yeah.
To me, because they also pay attention to Holocaust tourism, it sort of feels like that meeting with a rabbi makes up for, like, get them out of the role of the tourists.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they talk, I mean, what's interesting, I challenge them on this is when I'm at my most critical and least friendly, you know, because I say, why do you have this rabbi? They say, we feel like the kids need a space for some kind of reflection. So because of the intensity of the experience, that they want to create a kind of space. I mean, it's interesting, I think, that they create a religious space for that. This is largely non-Jewish kids that are going, so the majority of those going, you know, Britain has a very small Jewish population, the majority of the children going aren't Jewish. In a sense, rather than having a kind of multi-faith or a no-faith commemorative space, they have a Jewish ceremony, but they encourage the kids to either to participate in that or in some ways to engage in some kind of secular or non-Jewish act of remembrance.
Can I just respond to this first? I just want to, because it's interesting that you're saying this, because for me, if you would have said that it's to, you know, stay into the line of them also maybe learning about, you know, also the Jewish religion and, you know, keeping it close to that, then I would say, oh yes, that sounds really interesting. But for me, that's more logical than using religion to reflect. If it would be for them to have an experience, you know, Judaism, with a rabbi, then I would say, oh wow, that's, but you understand what I mean?
I think for the Dutch audience, we're one of the most secular countries in the world. And although I went to state schools in Great Britain, it started every day with the hymns. And so in England, this whole religious aspect is far more part of daily life, so less strange. And I wanted to add, I used to be extremely critical of the whole program. And also the one-day idea. But having spoken to quite a few youngsters in the meantime that have been there, and specifically a project in Scotland, where I just happened to be with colleagues at one point, where I think there were 6 schools that all sent 2 students on the trip, and so the 12 students together, they got together and across the small town, just north of Edinburgh. They set up an amazing project. So although I can see the whole, you know, you have to reflect on what does it mean. And from the Polish side, I've heard so often the criticism of, you know, Poland's being now perceived as a place of camps. I think in a way this one-day trip is less having that effect than, for example, the trip from the Netherlands that most of my colleagues have been on is a 1-week trip to Poland.
Auschwitz, Soviet War, Majdanek, Treblinka in 1 week. Take a whole week for so it's really good to see how heads also themselves are over the years working on changing the program. And
No, and I think they are quite a reflective, self-reflective organisation. I think the rabbi thing is the thing that's the big issue at the moment within HET, is about how long do they persist with this or not, you know, because it's the thing they realise is the most.
I do think it's really amazing that there is a survivor there, and I think it sounds like an amazing project.
The survivor speaks. So the survivor doesn't accompany them to Auschwitz, but speaks beforehand.
I'm asking myself where there is any place for the subjectivity, for the activation and the participation of the youngsters, because we're always talking about process, of activating, of deciding themselves and letting them do something. And then you have a program where they are passive more or less the whole time, at least. I mean, I know what you do when you're in the Auschwitz Center and when you're in a cemetery and all those places. There is no place in which they themselves do something. So I asked myself how this process could contribute to something what we always call the process of thinking.
I mean, I think,
Now, it's interesting that there's actually the same approach to the First World War, where it's also two students going
That's right, the authentic side.
It would be interesting to see how they have their reflections afterwards. Because I cannot imagine there's a rabbi there. But the other thing where they do participate is you have these two students, and then they're actually sharing that with the others at their school. So then it becomes a bit more active, as I understand.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting, I think, is the active stages afterwards. So it's a more, I mean, there's discussion in the sessions before. There's a sense of some discussion at the camp itself, so that the educator will ask some questions. So maybe at the gateway to Auschwitz, the educator will stop and look at the tracks and say, here's the end of the tracks, where's the beginning of the tracks? And then say maybe like the beginning could be, say, somewhere like in Greece or in Hungary. This is where people were deported from. And maybe engage the students in a conversation about bystanders and who saw these and who was working in the railways and stuff. So there's a little bit of engagement. But I think it is interesting that there's a kind of moment of a shift from a more recipient kind of knowledge to a more active engagement is after Auschwitz. And this is, I think, part of the whole, I mean, this is, I think, to me, is one of the more problematic aspects of this day, is that it kind of works up to the point where you have this closing ceremony, and then the educator reads out these words from one of the Sonderkommando, members of the Sonderkommando, who, you know, where they're burying the testimony of some of the Sonderkommando into the ashes, which are then discovered. We've done as much as we could in you searching for the truth, you who have lived to see justice and liberty, what will you do? And what's interesting, I think, is that the students hear this twice. So they hear it once, huddled together in the cold, when it's about 8 at night, around the gas chamber with the candles and the shofar. So in the ceremony, they hear it for the first time, and then they hear it for the last time as they're sent back to their schools after the third seminar. So this becomes the kind of real watchword within the educational program, which is these words. Now, what is really interesting to me is that the educator, the way the educator frames this, the key educator, is to say he's speaking to you because you've been to Auschwitz. So the critical thing, I think, in the Auschwitz experience is that it turns a bunch of ordinary British school kids into, and the language they use explicitly is witnesses. So suddenly by going to the authentic place, then they become, in a sense, witnesses to the Holocaust. So that it's really about this kind of spatial fix, I think, you know, this kind of spatial fix to time. So that there's a sense in which part of the importance of the authentic sites is that they talk about the way that you learn more from going there than you do in a history textbook, is one of the things that the kids are told. So in a sense that it's not just, you know, history's kind of this dry, boring kind of experience. Actually, there's something about going there which means that it's much closer. And I think that the language of witnesses is really interesting, that this is an explicit language that's used, is that now the children have become witnesses of the Holocaust. They have a kind of different relationship with the Holocaust by dint of being at Auschwitz. And therefore, this is the moment when they're then activated in a sense to change. So to change themselves and then to change others. And so this is very much the kind of launch pad. So this becomes the, sort of the launch pad for a kind of active engagement. And I think it is striking to me how there's so much freighted upon this kind of transformative experience of this day spent at Auschwitz that kind of gradually builds up across the day. I don't think it's primarily seeing pre-war Jewish life in Auschwitz. It's not primarily in the Museum Auschwitz one. It's much more in the kind of Birkenau, in the shadow of the gas chamber. That there's suddenly this kind of witnessing takes place in the shadow of the gas chamber, which then is about kind of transformation. And I think that's like something we might want to, discuss. That I think highly of Holocaust Educational Trust voters. I am a friend, even though a critical friend of them. I think it's really striking to me that this is what they're seeing, taking children to Auschwitz doing, is to turn children into witnesses, which is really, I think, framed about this kind of notion of spatial fix to time, shrinking of distance, which, for Silas becomes this problematic, within her work.
And how?
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering how it is being followed up once they return to their schools. Because they are the two representatives of an entire school. They are in this witness status. They are being interviewed by their fellow pupils.
Yeah, so they will often do they'll create like a PowerPoint presentation for the school and show them. And in a sense, they kind of become ambassadors after this of Auschwitz, so Auschwitz ambassadors, who then introduce the rest of the school to Auschwitz. They might engage in an activity where they create a kind of memorial space in the school, or they might do something which is spoken about anti-bullying or about racism. And so the follow-up seminar is intended to help them to make that step from being at Auschwitz and becoming a witness and an ambassador to then transferring the lessons of Auschwitz to their community and to their school. And so that's very much the kind of final stage of, there's really a kind of creativity to that actually, that there's an encouragement of a kind of creative exploration of what this kind of moment of change that takes place in the shadow of the gas chambers, what you changed as a person, and now what do you do as a result of that change, that kind of transformation that takes place.
And it's part of history classes or it's social studies?
It's outside of the curriculum, so it's a kind of separate entity outside of the curriculum.
I'm thinking it's very interesting to look at parallel also with what we presume will happen when we meet a Holocaust survivor as well. You are becoming a witness meeting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, and the other thing I just want to point out that we're also, I think many of us in our response are isolating this one day as if this one day is the special thing. And I was in discussion with Ed when they started this out many years ago. And I think in that period it was the case. But it's not one day. It is a whole process. Yeah. And especially because now it's voluntary. You have to be allowed to go, just 2 per school. And now, of course, there are generations of students who've been. So in some schools there's a whole culture of course we're going to do 21st of March as a racist day, or because, and not just the ones that have been to Auschwitz, but also the ones that had wanted to go but couldn't go because they were into the school. So it is more than, I would say is we focus on this one day and what this one day does, but it's part of bigger programs.
Yeah. Although I think for Hetz, the one day is critical, isn't it? Because I think they see the one day as the moment. I mean, I think it's partly the survivor testimony is the first important moment. So I think the foundation of Hetz assumptions is, which is about authenticity, that the Holocaust is best experienced by meeting a survivor and going to an authentic Holocaust site. So authentic survivor, authentic site. And I mean, both framed around Auschwitz, we can historicise that. I think that's about the moment when this all develops within the UK. Like now, we maybe would take Treblinka or go to Baba Yar. I mean, we've moved east, haven't we, in many ways, in our understanding of the Holocaust. What Hetz is fearful of is the death of the last survivor. And so they don't know what to do when the last survivor is too old to go into British schools or to speak to their students. What they're looking at is the second generation, really interestingly, that there's something more authentic about listening to the voice of a child of the survivor than there is about listening to anyone else. And so they really kind of privilege, I think, if we think about kind of memory history, I think they privilege memory, or they experience kind of either the survivor or the place. That it's a kind of an engagement, an encounter with both of those that is most critical in bringing about a kind of transformation, which then means that the child goes back to tell that story and to kind of enact, transformation as a result of that.
No, I found it very stimulating, your whole reflection through the different examples about traveling, walking, visiting as more or less educational tool or as a mean with more or less transformative potential. I just wanted to give to link it with another experience from another part of Europe, which is perhaps less known, which is the March of Life organized every year in Srebrenica, and which is a highly interesting experience and a little bit different, even if there are some similar elements. And which was actually created since 2004, 2005, and the basic idea was to say, because those who survived Srebrenica had to go through 80 kilometers of enemy territory before they reached the non-occupied territory by the Bosnian Serb army. And many of them died also on this march. This was one very tight route to go through these lines. And actually, so since 10 years, it started by survivors. They decided to make the march back on 3 days. So actually, they start the 8th of July, and then they walk the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th, and they arrive the evening of the 10th in Srebrenica, and the 11th they participated in the big commemoration. And it started with some 100 people. In the meantime, there are around 5,000, 7,000 next year for the 20th anniversary, probably a peak again. I participated 3 years ago, and it was really a highly educational and interesting experience, especially to see the average age, which is 16, 17, 18 years old. And it's sort of also an initiation ritual. You see sometimes parents with their children, so they explain, here it was this was this, also people from the diaspora coming. At the same time, it's also the question of how much is this politicized, a moment of creating Bosniak identity through participating through such a ritual, etc., etc. But I think the whole of this, so this is not just traveling, this is really the walking experience. I think this is really something, and for 3 days under 40 degrees of heating, etc., and all these, what it impacts, walking through still considered as enemy territory, because it still Bosnian Serb territory, etc. So I think this whole question of walking experiences would be very interesting also in a comparative approach to see in different countries, in different contexts, for different events, what are experiences, what are rituals which are put ahead, and what are the different experiences linked to that.
Do I have? Oh, I can have less. Yeah, 1 more minute. Just I'll do 5, less than 5, because we have lunch. Just almost like a coda. This is, I got really interested in this and wrote about it in the end because of finding this. I was actually listening to this guy's interview, Erwin Baum, for other reasons, for writing a book about Holocaust landscapes. I was working a lot with survivor testimony, oral histories, and I was so struck by this guy, Erwin Baum, who goes back, he's in the Korczak orphanage, and he goes back on one of the anniversaries of Korczak's orphanage to Warsaw with his brother. And while he's in Warsaw, he decides that he's going to rent a taxi in Warsaw and ask the guy to take him to Auschwitz. So he rents this taxi in Warsaw, and the guy drives him to Auschwitz. And he gets out of the taxi at Birkenau, and he walks in the gateway of Birkenau, and then he walks back out, gets in the taxi and says, take me back to Warsaw. And he and his brother go back to Warsaw. So he does this whole journey, literally just to walk in and walk out. And what was really striking is, as I started to look at, I went to the USC, the Shoah Foundation archives, just because the search terms are kind of easier there, in terms of navigating an archive. I then started to listen to and watch all of the interviews with those who'd been on return visits to Auschwitz. And what I found was, actually there's tons of survivors that do this. So that they purposefully go back to Auschwitz in the 1990s, after the opening up of Eastern Europe, to walk in and walk out again. And what they want is and some of these guys show in their interview, they have this they show a photograph to their interviewer of them taken either holding the barbed wire or walking out of the gateway. And Baum's interesting because he talks about how this is liberation, and so many of them use that language, so this is liberation, this is freedom. And for me it was really interesting because it's again about transformation, the sense of Auschwitz as a kind of transformational space, like contemporary Auschwitz as a transformational space that offers for survivors freedom, I mean, what's interesting, I think, as I look through the survivors, is you get a much more mixed story. So that actually, there's those who go back and talk about Auschwitz as this space where it's a journey of transformation and freedom. And then you hear a little bit later on in the story that actually it's a lot more complex than that. But going back to Auschwitz, also, there's a lot, it's a kind of moment of closure, but it's a moment of opening as well. And then it's a much more kind of mixed story that it's a kind of dangerous space to go back to. There's a survivor who, her testimony is really interesting. She talks about the fact that she doesn't want to go back to Auschwitz, but her kids are forcing her to do it. And so many survivors talk about this. They don't want to go back. It's actually their kids who say, "Mom, Dad, take me to Auschwitz." You know, American Jewish kids in the 1990s, 2000s, and they're like, you know, do I have to? And eventually they agree, okay, I'll take the kids back to Auschwitz and I'll show them. We'll go everywhere. We'll do a little roots pilgrimage and we'll go and see them at the hometown, you know, the ghetto, Auschwitz, and then be done. She's amazing. She talks about how she chooses special footwear for the journey. So she goes and buys a pair of sneakers, of training shoes, trainers, because she wants to go back not as a Jew, but as an American tourist. So her identity is not as a survivor returning to Auschwitz, but she wants to be mistaken for an American tourist, so she gets the footwear of the American tourist. And she says that she thinks also that these shoes might protect her from walking there, that actually it gives her a kind of distance. So it's this kind of attempt at a distancing. And her testimony is really interesting because for her, going back to Auschwitz is this very traumatic experience, that she suddenly realizes that she needs more than safety footwear to be protected from the kind of pain of this, you know, kind of re-experience. And so you've got this very interesting sense that in some ways I think that for Baum, Auschwitz is important to go back to experience liberation. It's a kind of simple story of transformation. So I was interested in that because I was kind of interested in this notion, the broader notion of almost taking anyone to Auschwitz. Is there a sense of just the power of the place that transforms you? You know, a British cynical 16-year-old is transformed into a kind of human rights activist by the fact that they go to the crematory at Auschwitz. You know, Baum is suddenly liberated. The survivor stories become, you know, much more problematic because it's a really ambivalent space. And the other thing I think that really struck me about looking at the survivors' return visits was how much survivors were struck by change. And again, this is this issue of spatial fix, I think. And this becomes a motif in so many of these survivors' stories, that so many of these survivors talk about the green grass at Birkenau. That's the thing that they can't believe, that this muddy site has been transformed into this green space. And for them, it's almost like the very stuff, the very ground under their feet has changed. I think that's what's really striking about the narrative of Kitty Hart and others like her, is that even though she's going back to the same place, you know, in some ways you think that the thing that never changes is kind of the earth itself. The kind of ground under our feet is the one thing that we can rely upon. Everything else may change, you know, interpretation and everything, but at least the ground under our feet never moves. And I think it's really striking that Kitty Hart goes back to Auschwitz, and it's like the place is entirely different because the ground has changed. And it's no longer a muddy site where you're worried about losing your shoes, but it's become this kind of green space, you know, this kind of grassed over site. And again, when she takes her son back there, the thing that she obsessively talks to her son about is the grass. Because she just can't believe that the site has changed in such a way. And I think it's, in some ways, I think I see a little bit of a connection between Susan Silas and Kitty Hart in some ways, that they both are struck by the way in which there's an assumption that going back in some ways brings you closer to the events, but actually it just foregrounds the huge chasm between then and now, and between the Holocaust and the present. And I think that's one of the kind of key ideas that I think is really, you've talked about handling past and present a little bit already, I think it is really interesting to think about, is how do you make a jump from the past to the present? Because I think that's for Holocaust Education Trust, that's their real struggle, is that in a sense they take kids back to Auschwitz because they want to tackle racism in British schools. I mean, that's why the British state fund trips to Auschwitz, is because the British state wants to tackle racism and bullying in British schools. That there's a kind of presentist agenda, and I think this is one of the real challenges of kind of Holocaust education. Is in some ways I almost wonder whether we put too much pressure on the Holocaust to achieve transformation of society. So it's almost like we kind of don't. There's a lot of things we want to change in contemporary society, and we almost like dump it all on the Holocaust. like, you know, the Holocaust will achieve that kind of transformation to us. And I think, to me, that's kind of just putting way too much freight and pressure on the Holocaust, or too much pressure and freight on Auschwitz. That it would be nice to think that all of Britain's contemporary problems could be solved by sending 2 kids from every state school to Auschwitz, but it feels like racism in Britain is too deeply and firmly embedded to achieve a kind of radical transformation solely by doing that. And I think that, to me, is one of the real kind of nub issues, or the kind of crucial key issues in a lot of the work that we all do is almost, I think, to ask ourselves a fundamental question of what is it that I hope the Holocaust or genocide will achieve. Like, why do I teach it? And, you know, for me, I teach it to students, undergraduates, you know, others for to primary school or secondary school kids. What is it that we want from that? And in some ways, do we expect too much of that? That I'm really struck by all of the people that I look at, that I think they go to these places wanting something to happen, and I think sometimes it doesn't. And I kind of wonder if there's a sense in which we almost freight the Holocaust and genocide, education and memory with just too many expectations, and that we expect it to solve a whole set of societal problems that it can't never do. You know, and I think there's issues that kind of about authenticity and transformation, and really about past and present, and the connections between those are kind of the kind of critical issues in many ways to try and think about engagement.
Thank you.
Maybe a minute or two to ask some questions.
Yeah, with all of this, what you say, like the Holocaust education in use, I was a bit struck with what you said, like, okay, because they are mainly analyzing the Jewish situation because that's what that was the main victims and so on. But I think this I find it very wrong, because there should be more emphasis on this, how the ideology actually reached to many other people and reach many other victims. And I don't know, I found it like simplifying a little bit this, and then also provoking this that many young people do not know about the other victims of the Holocaust, and they know that the Holocaust happened only to the Jews.
Yeah, and I think that, there's some big issues there, aren't there, which is about the sort of fundamentals of what, it's kind of the explanatory fundamentals of the Holocaust. So is the Holocaust primarily about Jewish victims and therefore primarily about anti-Semitism? Or is the Holocaust about other things? Those are the really big questions, aren't there? We touched on this already, I think, didn't we, about uniqueness versus positioning the Holocaust within the context of genocide? Like that, that's an ideological statement, I think, isn't it? Is whether I foreground anti-Semitism or whether I position the Holocaust, say, within 200-300 years of colonial genocide. I'm making it, those are historiographical positions that you'll find within the contemporary history, and those are very different positions. And I think a lot of what I think is interesting is about what comes first, the lessons or the history. So I think sometimes it can be like, okay, the lesson I want the kids to learn is the importance of anti-racism. So therefore I look at anti-Semitism, a moment of historic anti-Semitism, and therefore the Holocaust is an experience of anti-Semitism. I think you could position it, I think in some ways the Holocaust is this horribly complex event, isn't it? Within a much more bigger complex notion of something like genocide. That I think it's very difficult to draw simple lessons out of that. I think to me that's one of the really big problems in some ways with a lot of what we do, is that I think Holocaust Educational Trust really, I think this is where they fall down, is in Seminar 3, in a sense they reduce the complexity of the Holocaust to 10 flashcards, which students have to choose what the key lesson of the Holocaust is. And I can see why they do that, because they really feel like, by golly, we've got to have some lesson. We can't just leave them hanging, like we need some kind of lesson because we need to change the world. But I've been studying the Holocaust for 20 years, I don't know what the lesson of the Holocaust is. I just think I find new things all the time, and I wouldn't feel like I could boil the Holocaust down to one single lesson. And I think the Holocaust is this really complex mix of colonial genocide, of economics, of anti-Semitism. There's all sorts of stuff. I don't know what I'd say, I've studied the Holocaust for 20 years. I don't know what I'd say the lesson of the Holocaust should be. Charlie Mayer, he's a historian at Harvard. He was asked, what's the lesson of the Holocaust? He said, don't vote for Hitler. And it's like, but Hitler's not standing anywhere at the moment. And I think that's one of Peter Novick, you can't reduce the Holocaust to a bumper sticker. I think that's one of the things, and I think this is the difficulty about the past. Like, to me, the past is this really complex thing. And what I don't want is, I don't want the past, I think there are connections between past and present. But I think, almost for me, the really critical issue is to think about what those connections are, and how do we deal with this.
There are all of the mechanisms we're working at that time, and the mechanism of the ideology still kind of aren't. I think we don't put enough attention also to this.
I have to stop you here. Please, let's continue during lunch. Thank you so much for your work.